there is a tendency in studying the Holocaust to try to make it universally interesting to non-Jews by expanding the categories of victims. The Nazis hated many groups of people. The Nazis were willing to kill many groups of people when they're in their way. The Nazis feared no one like they feared the Jews. And that is the difference between the rates of carnage that affected Jews, mentally ill or handicapped people, gypsies, gay people. In no other place in Europe was, with regard to no other category, was the pursuit so relentless across Europe. For instance, the Nazis simply didn't care about gay people who were not having sex with German soldiers. The only gay men they cared about were German gay men, because they weren't reproducing, and they were undermining a masculine ideal of reproduction, and people who were having sex with gay German soldiers. Otherwise, they simply didn't care. It was not a threat to them. They believed homosexuality was curable under the right conditions, mostly by terrifying people. The Nazis did not kill the people in mental institutions in the Netherlands or France. In the Netherlands, they killed Jewish inmates of mental institutions, but not non-Jews, or Denmark or Norway and so on. So they did in Eastern Europe. The fate of gypsies was very different, depending on whether gypsies were itinerant, that is, moved around, or stayed put. It was different in areas. For instance, almost all of the Jews in Estonia and Latvia were slaughtered. In Lithuania, they almost all survived, right next door to each other. Muslim gypsies were often spared. I don't know why, where others were not. So you see how there's all this variation. The Germans did not encourage their allies to adopt laws to enact euthanasia on people in mental institutions or to persecute gay people, but they relentlessly tried to persuade their allies to persecute Jews. So this is the reality of it. And of course, the history of anti-Semitism is deeply embedded in Western culture. It has morphed at various times. It has gone from being a religious hatred, a sort of sense that the problem with Jews is they haven't accepted the light of the Gospels according to Christians. They therefore must be made to, they must live, but they must live in misery as an example to others of what rejecting the doctrine. That is a form of anti-Semitism that lived on into the 20th century. It lives on actually into the 21st in Eastern Europe. But then it was replaced by newer forms that came after the French Revolution. Basically, it was a famous person at the French National Assembly who claimed we give all rights to the Jews as individuals, but none to them as a category. And the notion was they would all become more like the rest of us, and that would be fine. And then in the course of the 19th century, some people thought the problem with the Jews is they had become too like the rest of us, prosperous, successful, enjoying their civil rights, or they hadn't become enough like the rest of us. And this fed various forms of anti-Semitism. And then the third form that morphs in is the sort of notion with pseudoscientific ideas in the late 19th century that they are biologically different from everybody else, or their mentality is different. So anti-Semitism is, in short, in the Western world, a kind of protean hatred. It comes, it goes, it takes new forms, sometimes it lingers on in old forms. The real question is, and it is, I think, therefore, ineradicable in Western culture. It's there, it's this deep structure that can be activated. But the question is, what activates it? Why is it weak in some times, anti-Semitism is weak at some times, strong in others? Why it can be simultaneously weak and strong in very close places. Students of European history know that Vienna elected an anti-Semitic mayor in the 1890s. But Budapest elected a Jew to be mayor. And they are how far apart on the Danube River? Not very. So one has to account for what makes this latent hostility sometimes virulent and sometimes powerless. And my notion is, ironically, because the anti-Semites say that Jews are parasites, right? But the ironic thing is anti-Semitism is never strong enough to succeed politically unless it can ride on something else. It's parasitic. And what it has to ride on is a sense of economic or social crisis that so unnerves the non-Jewish population that enough of them are desperate enough to seize on this as an explanation and a solution. And that, I think, explains the waxing and the waning, because in times in modern European history when prosperity has been general, anti-Semitism is not very successful. It may be loud, there may be individuals who are constantly peddling it, but it doesn't work. But when times get tough, the old saying is that anti-Semitism rises and falls in inverse relationship to the stock market. And that's, so I think, I have always in my work taken a rather restrictive definition of the Holocaust. The Holocaust is primarily what happened to Jews. It is because the murder of the Jews was driven by a particular kind of hatred. It was a paranoid fear in the way that, the murder of the mentally ill is not driven by fear. It's driven by it's a kind of practical murder. They cost us a lot of money. Why should we maintain them? Let's get rid of them. And in a society that has no moral compass, whose only standard is what's good for us, it strengthens the state, then that becomes a powerful argument, and they do it. But the persecution of the Jews is driven by the deep-rooted sense of difference that is activatable by fear.
Una pregunta más bien histórica. Dijo que la matanza mayor fue del 42 al 43 y los países empezaron a dejar de colaborar de la misma manera al oír las amenazas, ¿no?, de que se iban a juzgar después. ¿Qué pasa con el caso Hungría, que fue tan tarde la incursión de...
Hungary is the country that is most like Germany in Europe with regard to anti-Semitism. It is the country in which, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, opportunities for Jews were the greatest, as in Germany. And where many Jews became very prosperous, they acculturated very strongly. Germany and Hungary were the European homes of Reform Judaism, Neolog Judaism. They, sort of approaching Christian practice in certain ways and so on. But they were also the countries in which, precisely because Jews were, relatively speaking, many Jews were successful, not all of them, of course, that they attracted the envy and resentment of the non-Jews who were not as successful. And then what happened to Hungary after 1918 is very similar to what happened to Germany, in the sense that there was an economic downturn that occurred, but there was also a territorial amputation. Germany lost territory by virtue of defeat in the First World War. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, which also lost, had two parts. The parts that were ruled by Austria, and the parts that were ruled by Hungary. Many of the parts that were ruled by Hungary were given away to Yugoslavia, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and so forth. So in both countries, you had this sense of national humiliation, coupled with a desire to get territory back, coupled with envy and resentment toward the Jews, and this all gets mixed up because also in both countries, leftist revolutions occurred in the aftermath of the revolution in Russia. And in both countries, briefly, there were prominent Jews who were associated with the communist movement. Bela Kun was the dictator who briefly ruled in Budapest. Rosa Luxemburg and Kurt Eisner in Munich became briefly powerful in Germany. That those imitation revolutions of the Bolsheviks were put down, but they cemented the link in the minds of some Germans and Hungarians that the Jews are subversive leftists. They're also very successful business people. They're very successful professionals, and that they are all somehow generating from the misery that we feel. And so this was the combustible thing. In both countries, it was extremely strong. And then what happens is, of course, Germany's powerful. Germany's winning the war. So the right-wingers in Hungary Admiral Horthy is the regent and so forth. The right-wingers in Hungary are constantly trying to get the ear of the government and suggesting that maybe we should cooperate with the Germans. And they only, by very narrow margins, the Hungarian government, unlike the Romanian and the Bulgarian, say, no, we're going to preserve our independence. They join in the invasion of the Soviet Union. They take 42,000 Hungarian Jews into labor battalions that they send with those invading forces. And most of them actually, are worked to death. But they don't deliver Jews to the concentration, to the death camps. And then in 1944, the Russians are on the horizon. They're about to come in. The upper hand, the government becomes the right wing takes over the government. And its last hope, and the Russians are coming, they know they're going to lose the war, its last hope is to finally achieve this ethnic cleansing that they have been wanting for years. And Eichmann arrives in Budapest, he goes to the Interior Ministry, he says, we want to start deporting the Jews because we've been frustrated all these years, we haven't. And the Hungarian officials in the Interior Ministry literally open the drawer of a desk and say, we have a plan for you. We know how to do this. Because we can basically, the way we can make most efficient use of the railroads is we deport people. They made a map of the country which looked like a snail shell. And you start deporting from the northeast, and then the north central, then the northwest, then the southwest, and then the southeast, and then Budapest was last. And so, and this is the way they are able to carry this out. They deported 437,000 people in 55 days. And there were never more than 6 trains running on any given day. That's how it is possible to, and so that's my potted history of Hungary for this period. But that's what it is. It is the country most like Germany in the triggers for this.
Para nosotros como judíos, aprender el Holocausto es algo que a la mayoría de nosotros se nos da de manera natural. Pero yo trabajo en un ambiente no judío. Mi pregunta para usted es, ¿qué tengo que hacer yo como docente para poder animar a los alumnos no judíos, que son mi interés principal, a conocer acerca de este tema? Gracias. Sorry.
Yeah, well, 3 fundamental points. This is like asking me to, write a short note. Talking longer is always easier than talking short. I would say the first fundamental point is that Nazi Germany did this with its little finger. With its little finger. The resources allocated to building a death camp were small, tiny. Which is why, if you go today to the sites at Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, these are places that killed roughly 1.7 million people. You will find nothing but archaeological digs. They were easy to put up and easy to tear down. They cost almost nothing. Now, and then remember my point about 6 trains a day from Hungary, 55 days. In fact, the total number of trains used to deport people to the death camps, 3 million people, is 2,000 trains. In 1942 and 43, when the murder was at the height, there were 30,000 trains a day running in Germany. You see what I mean? The fraction is infinitesimal. The number of people required to guard these camps, there were never more than 120 people at Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec at any given time. Only 20 to 30 of them were German in the staffs. They used auxiliaries that they recruited from Eastern Europe. This costs almost nothing. And then when you consider that the trains that were used were old-fashioned, dilapidated relics, that otherwise that's why they were so slow. And the locomotives were, hardly cutting edge. And so they did this with their little finger. And that is, I think, an important and terrifying fact about this. That, because we tend to think of, we imagine that the Nazi state devoted enormous energies to this. And there were individuals who did, but a country, when a government is behind a program of mass murder, it can do a lot with very little. So that's the first one. I don't know whether I think the second one is probably the point I just tried to make with this lecture, that human rights are what we all must always be defending. And this may relate to your second question about how do you interest non-Jews. I was raised in a Roman Catholic home. I was confirmed. I then left the church after that, rapidly. But you know, and when I go to speak in synagogues and so forth, sometimes people say, "What are you doing? Why are you interested in this?" and so forth. My short answer to that is, the Jews didn't do it. The people who should be most interested in this are the equivalents of the people who did it, right? And so that would be my second point, that this is obviously a study of enormous importance to Jews for profound reasons. But it's a really important story for non-Jews, because it's a story about what the worst of what their societies are capable of, and the rationalizations that they can invent to do this, and that is part of a liberal, humanistic education for everyone. It's hard to convince people, of course, young people of that, because their view of the world is restricted. But with young people, I think the way to get them to see the importance of this is always to introduce them to people who are different. To get them to, you know, I think I was sensitized to this in part because I grew up in a suburb of the city of Austin, which it happened, you know, this is post-war America, this is the 1950s, you know, the tract houses are going up all over the place, and people are emptying out of the cities, and they're living out in green space for the first time in their lives, and so on. Well, as it happened, the town that I lived in, there was the north side of town where I lived had a very large Jewish population. And I went to more bar mitzvahs than confirmations. Well, that's the kind of thing that gives you a stake, because then you're really, these are real people. Their lives are real lives. And so I think that's terribly important for giving young people a sense. And that applies to lots of different forms of diversity issues, not just to this one in particular. I hope that covers it.
Thank you.
Hi. You mentioned right now that German Nazis did this with their little finger, with very little force.
Yeah.
And I guess you hear this very often, this question. Why did the Jews didn't rise up and went directly like...
Well,
I mean, you must hear this a lot. But.
I do. I've written a whole chapter about this in the book that's coming out. In the first place, who could see what was coming? I mean, no state had ever done this before. There had been pogroms, and there were standard ways of buying off the pogromists. No state had ever done this before. And remember, most of the Jews are out there in the old Pale of Settlement. They're in Poland and Lithuania and the Soviet Union. There were very different degrees of information flow to those places. Even after they come into Poland, they ghettoize the Jews, they treat them horribly. Hundreds of thousands of people died, but not millions. And then all of a sudden, in the beginning of 1942, it starts. And the Germans are actually, partly intentionally, partly accidentally, they are very shrewd about how they do it. Because ghettos that are emptied, you know, at opposite corners of the country. So the flow of information is, you know, Lublin is emptied and killed relatively late, Krakow relatively early, you know, and human beings have a tremendous capacity to tell themselves that it's not going to be as bad as they've heard. There is a remarkable book by a man named Khalil Perechotnik, and he died in 1944. But in 1941-42, he was first a ghetto policeman in one of the ghettos. He was part of the Jewish police. And then he fled, and he became part of the resistance. And he reports in this long chapter that I quoted about a town in the general government, that is the non-annexed part of Poland, that hears about a massacre over the border in Ukraine. And they say that 30,000 people were shot in that and so forth. How can one believe that? And so, and then you read these 4 paragraphs. It goes from, I've heard that this is happening, and by the time you get to the 4th paragraph, it can't be true. And that's this human capacity to say, because after all, you know, and remember, people have families, they're worried about their children, they're thinking about, it's very hard to focus on the threat. Right? And then something that I think is understood by actually both Jewish and Gentile scholars on this, and that is the Jewish community of these places was enormously internally divided. There were Zionists and Bundists. There were Hasidim and Reformists. There were all these different traditions, and then you graft onto that the different national places. One of the reasons why resistance in the concentration camps is very hard to, not the death camps now, because there's not much chance for resistance, but the concentration camps, is linguistic differences. And the mistrust that arises between people who come from one, it's a Jewish community, but it's Greek. And there's another one that's Lithuanian. So I think it is, what we have to remember is that these are people faced with excruciating and unprecedented challenges. And they don't have much time to figure out how to deal with it, because the massacre is at its peak in 1942. The ones in the Soviet Union literally hardly know what hit them, because the Germans arrive and they start killing everybody. So I think we have to have tremendous sympathy for that, and not say, why didn't they fight back? Because how could they have fought back? I mean, the other thing is they were so outgunned. Remember the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, marvelous, inspirational event. The Germans lost something like 15 casualties, and 53,000 people get marched off to their deaths. That's how uneven it was. So that's the way I see it. I used to tell this to my students, not so much the issue of resistance, but the issue of how people behaved in the ghettos. One of the most famous images of the Holocaust, I'm sure you all know it, is the little boy in the cloth cap in the Warsaw Ghetto who's got his hands up. Now, there's some controversy about the source of that photograph, but that is what was actually being photographed there. But the document that it comes from, which is an SS report on the liquidation of the ghetto, says that these people had been rooted out of the cellars, okay, during the Warsaw Uprising. The most remarkable thing about that photograph is almost never commented on. There's not only one boy with his hands up, there are 3 children under the age of 10 behind him. So there's 4 children in March of 1943. Now we know how many children under the age of 10 were officially, according to the ghetto administration, still alive in the Warsaw Ghetto on December 31st, 1942. It's under 500. We also know that in March, the preceding September, Romkowski, the head of the Jewish ghetto, had made this famous, horrible speech, "Give me your children." And everybody under the age of 10 was shipped out, except, here's my punchline, except the children of the Jewish council members and the Jewish police force. That is very likely to have been true in Warsaw as well. Those 500 children are all people who are connected. They're connected to somebody who had status or in the ghetto. Now, on the one hand, you sort of say, and probably to people who had a role in deciding who would be deported instead. or even in some cases, as members of the Jewish councils had advocated against resistance because it was dangerous and something like that. Now, on the one hand, you hear that and there's this immediate temptation to moral judgment because these people had saved their own children at the expense of others. But what parent wouldn't? You see what I mean? That's not about those people. That's about what the Germans were doing to them. And the choiceless choices with which they were confronted. So I get this question all the time, and I end up delivering a sermon about not judging these people.
Última pregunta. ¿Está el micrófono aquí? Porque vamos a ir terminando, así que por favor.
Dr. Hayes, if you can share us what's coming next. If you can share your vision for the next 10 or 20 years coming in Europe. Europe is changing the history, blocking this part of the history and the educations for kids, youngs. They are not growing with this anymore. So, what do you think is coming with the generations, next generations, that they will know nothing about this?
Well, I think in Europe in general, the greatest challenge we face is that people, in multiple ways, not just about the Holocaust, in multiple ways are forgetting the lessons of World War II. I mean, they're forgetting what World War II taught us. What World War II taught us is that Europe needed to cooperate and unite. What World War II taught us was that if you don't have a welfare state that provides adequate social services to your people, you will get fascism or communism. You know, the bargain that was made after World War II is that people will give up extremism in return for social welfare and the quality of life. And that has been deeply undercut by neoliberal attitudes about austerity and so forth. So we face this in a host of issues. With regard to the Shoah, the odd thing is that when I started teaching about it in the mid to late 80s, most people didn't know much. And they knew more about the war than they knew about the Shoah. I used to say they can't see the Holocaust through the smoke of war. Nowadays it's the reverse. They can't see the war through the smoke of the crematorium. And they think this whole period is about the Holocaust. And one of the things that I try to do as a teacher is get them to see how the two things are very closely related. And in the first place, we know about genocide that it almost always has to occur under cover of war. That was true with the Armenians, that was true in the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, that's true in World War II. So the big test of all of us is, are we going to remember the lessons of this horrible era? Because it was murderous in a host of ways. 6 million Jews, 36.5 million Europeans altogether. The carnage is unbelievable. The destruction was extraordinary. A city like Cologne, 90% of it was in ashes and ruin at the end. The reconstruction period took a very long time. Even, I first went to Germany in December of 1968. I first toured around the country in the spring of 1969. I still saw bombed out sites everywhere. I saw the Frankfurt Opera House was still a ruin with trees growing out of the roof. This was almost 25 years after the end of the war. It's a kind of physical manifestation. So there's a lot at stake here. Now, we have the current situation with the Polish government, where they basically have criminalized saying anything about Polish collaboration with the Holocaust. And my response about the Poles is very much like my response about the people in the ghettos. These people were subjected to enormous stress and strain, and threats. And under those this was a Hobbesian universe that was created in occupied Poland. And many of them succumbed to the temptations. Thousands of them saved Jews. There are more Poles commemorated at Yad Vashem than anybody else. But thousands of them also turned Jews in. Thousands of them basically thought that their way to save their own lives make sure the Germans don't come and burn the village, is root all the Jews out of hiding and deliver them to the Germans. And of course, thousands of Poles did this. And the government is saying you can't say that because all you can talk about is the heroism. Well, this is, extremely discouraging because you can't learn from the past if you distort it in that fashion. And one of the reasons why German democracy is now a great deal stronger than Polish democracy is because the Germans have looked hard at the worst of which they are capable. They know it, they're afraid of it, and that leads them to be more moderate in their political behavior. But a country that can't face up to its own sins is a country that is likely to commit more of them.